In the quiet heart of the palace, whispers began to spread. Portraits of Princess Diana were vanishing, floral tributes replaced, and familiar rooms altered. For Catherine, these changes felt like a silent rewriting of history. What began as subtle adjustments soon revealed a deeper truth. This was not about decor. It was about erasing a mother's memory. Catherine knew she could not stand by. Stay with us as we uncover the private battles, the public fallout, and the emotional stand that would shake the monarchy's gilded walls forever. The whisper that started it all. It began like so many palace secrets do, not with an official announcement, but with a murmur passed from one member of staff to another. Deep in the hushed corridors of royal life, a quiet but unsettling rumor began to take shape. Queen Camilla, they said, had ordered the removal of Princess Diana's personal tributes and treasured memorabilia from certain royal rooms. There was no written notice, no public explanation, only the subtle movements of change unfolding in the shadows. A housekeeper noticed the first shift. A framed photograph of Diana that had hung in a side gallery for decades was carefully taken down. No replacement appeared in its place. The following day, the florists who regularly delivered lilies to a particular reception room found their orders altered. The arrangements were changed to entirely different blooms, ones with no known connection to the late princess. By the end of the week, the changes could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. A small alcove in Kensington Palace that had been quietly preserved for years in Diana's memory was suddenly transformed. The soft lighting was gone, the table with her handwritten letters replaced, and in its place stood a polished display more suited to formal state receptions. For those who had worked in the palace during Diana's lifetime, the change felt almost like the closing of a chapter no one had agreed to end. When the news reached Catherine, it came not from headlines or public chatter, but from the lips of a trusted aide. The aide's tone was careful, almost apologetic, as if speaking the words themselves might cause trouble. Catherine listened in silence, her expression still, but her heart sinking. She understood better than most how symbols hold power in the royal world, and she knew that removing these tributes was not a simple matter of decoration. In that moment, an unease settled over her. It was not anger, not yet, but a quiet knowing that something was shifting beneath the polished surface of palace life. It was the kind of change that could not be easily reversed, and Catherine could feel the weight of what it might mean for her family, for her husband, and for the memory of the woman whose absence was still felt like a presence. She did not speak of it that evening. She carried it with her through the day, through the ceremonies and polite conversations, her mind replaying the images of those missing photographs and replaced flowers. Somewhere inside her, the whisper had already become a warning. Catherine's private world shaken. The palace was unusually still that morning, the kind of stillness that made every footstep echo as though the walls themselves were listening. Catherine was moving between engagements, her heels clicking in a steady rhythm against the polished marble floor of a rarely used hall. She had walked this route many times before, often allowing her pace to slow at a particular spot where a striking portrait of Princess Diana had hung for years. It was one of her favorites, not because of its grandeur or the ornate gold frame, but because of the way it captured Diana's eyes. There was something in them, a blend of warmth and unspoken sorrow, that seemed to look right through you. To Catherine, it was a reminder of a woman who had loved fiercely and suffered quietly, yet never lost her grace. Today, though, her footsteps faltered. The wall was bare, the portrait was gone, leaving behind only a faint rectangle of lighter paint, as though the wall itself remembered what had once been there. Catherine stopped mid-step, her breath catching before she could control it. The absence was like a physical blow, not because of the missing canvas alone, but because of the flood of memories it unleashed. She thought of William as a boy, his head bowed in grief at his mother's funeral, his young shoulders carrying a weight no child should bear. She thought of the quiet moments they had shared when he spoke of Diana not as a public figure, but as his mum. Funny, kind, and heartbreakingly absent. That portrait had been more than art. For Catherine, it was a guardian of memory, a silent storyteller that connected past to present. Its absence felt like a door slamming shut in a place where certain doors were meant to remain open. Her mind raced. Who had ordered its removal? Why now? Was this part of the subtle, unsettling changes she had heard murmurs about in hushed corridors? And more troubling still, what message was being sent by erasing that image from such a prominent place? She resumed walking, her face composed, her posture unbroken for the sake of the staff who greeted her with polite nods. But inside, something twisted. In the world she had married into, silence was often the safest weapon. Measured words, careful glances, unspoken battles. Yet in moments like this, silence felt like complicity. She wrestled with her duty to remain neutral and her instinct to protect the legacy of a woman she had never met, but whose influence touched every corner of her family life. By the time she reached the end of the hall, Catherine had made a quiet decision. She would not speak of it yet. This was not a moment for impulsive words. It was a moment to observe, to wait, to understand the currents moving beneath the surface. But deep within her, the whispers she had dismissed were no longer shadows. This was real. This was deliberate. And it was personal. A silent war of symbols. It began with details so small that most people would never notice. A crest embossed in gold on royal stationery was no longer the familiar design that had quietly honored Diana's era. In its place appeared a new crest, one that reflected Queen Camilla's preference. The change was subtle enough to pass as modernization, yet deliberate enough for those within the palace to understand it was more than an update. In the grand dining room, seating arrangements that had followed a familiar pattern for years were suddenly altered. Places once reserved for charities and guests connected to Diana's causes were reassigned. In their stead came new faces, patrons and allies linked closely to Camilla's network. The change did not cause a public stir, but within the walls of the palace it was noticed by those who remembered the old order. Decorative choices followed suit. Rooms that had once carried faint echoes of Diana's style were being redecorated. The soft pastels she had favored were replaced with richer, more formal tones. Personal photographs that had been fixtures for decades were taken down and replaced with landscapes or official portraits that told a different story. Even the arrangement of fresh flowers, a quiet but constant tradition, shifted from Diana's preferred lilies to blooms Camilla admired. To outsiders, these changes seemed harmless, even expected. Every royal household undergoes redecorations and ceremonial adjustments. But Catherine saw the pattern. She understood that in a monarchy, symbols are power. The emblems, the seating plans, and the visual language of a room all carry meaning that shapes how history is remembered. What was unfolding before her eyes was not a clash of words or a battle in the press. It was a slow rewriting of the palace's memory, one small change at a time. She felt the weight of it with each new alteration. To the public, these moments would never be visible, but to Catherine they formed a quiet storm. She could sense that if nothing was said, these subtle shifts could one day erase the threads that kept Diana's spirit alive within the palace walls. It was a war fought without speeches or declarations, a war of symbols that most would never realize was happening until the past had been quietly replaced. William's pain and resolve. The children had long been asleep, the palace hallways wrapped in the kind of deep quiet that only comes after midnight. The heavy curtains muffled the sounds of the city beyond, and the dim wall sconces threw soft pools of light along the carpeted corridors. Catherine walked slowly toward William's study, her thoughts circling the image of the bare wall where Diana's portrait had once hung. She found him alone, a single lamp casting a warm amber glow over the desk where he sat reviewing papers. The rest of the room was steeped in shadow, save for the faint light from the fireplace. He looked up the moment she stepped inside, his eyes narrowing slightly in concern. Catherine closed the door behind her with deliberate care, letting the latch click into place. For a few moments, she simply stood there, gathering her thoughts, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. When she began, her voice was steady, but the sadness beneath it was unmistakable. She told him about the missing portrait, the subtle rearrangements in the seating plan at recent events, and the quiet disappearance of symbols that had once carried Diana's presence through the palace. William listened in silence, his expression calm, but she saw the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He did not interrupt, not even when her voice faltered. When she finished, the quiet stretched between them. William leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her, as though weighing the right words. His composure was the kind that could fool anyone who did not know him well. But Catherine knew better. Beneath the stillness was an anger forged long ago, tempered by years of having to hide it behind duty. He spoke at last, his tone low but resolute. He told her about the promises he had made to himself as a boy, standing in the cold shadow of his mother's funeral. Promises to keep her spirit alive, to ensure that her warmth, her compassion, and her refusal to turn away from those in need would remain part of the monarchy's heartbeat. He spoke of the unbreakable bond the public still felt with Diana, a bond that no policy or speech could replicate. To erase her from the palace's story, he said, was not just an insult to her memory. It was a dangerous mistake that could weaken the fragile bridge between the crown and the people. Catherine reached across the desk and took his hand. In that simple gesture, their understanding was complete. Watching quietly was no longer an option. If they stayed silent, the slow erasure would continue until there was nothing left to protect. They did not yet know the exact shape their response would take, but they knew this much: they would act. In the stillness of that night, a quiet pact was made. Diana's memory would not fade into the shadows, not while they still had a voice and not without a fight. The staff who remember. The air in the small drawing room felt heavier than usual, as if it carried the weight of untold stories and memories too fragile to be spoken aloud in the wrong company. Catherine had chosen this space carefully. It was far from the main corridors, tucked behind a series of side passages, a room used more for quiet reflection than official business. Here, conversations could take place without curious eyes peering in or ears pressed against the wall. She had invited only a select few, men and women who had served the palace for decades, whose steps had once echoed in rhythm with Princess Diana's. They arrived quietly, each slipping through the door with the soft dignity of long service. Some bore the visible traces of years in the household, slightly stooped shoulders, measured movements, and expressions trained to reveal nothing in public. At first, the talk was light and polite. The weather, a recent charity event, the subtle changes in the palace gardens, safe topics that belonged to the surface of palace life. Catherine did not rush them. She knew that real stories, the ones that mattered, did not appear on command. They needed space to breathe and trust to take root. It was a former footman who broke the surface first. He told of a morning years ago when Diana, already late for an appointment, stopped to ask after his mother. She had remembered a detail from a passing conversation months before. His voice softened as he spoke, as though he were standing in that moment again. A housekeeper followed with her own memory, how Diana had carried armfuls of flowers into a reception room, laughing as she arranged them herself, unconcerned with protocol. In their telling, the warmth of those moments seemed to fill the room. But as the recollections grew, another current emerged, quieter and more cautious. An attendant mentioned that certain photographs, once prominently displayed, had disappeared from their places. Another noted how several of Diana's beloved charities no longer held the same prominence in palace communications. The words were spoken with care, almost in whispers, as though the walls themselves might disapprove. There was fear here, Catherine realized, not of her, but of the invisible boundaries that governed palace life. In this world, speaking too openly could end a career built over decades. The rule was unspoken yet absolute: see, remember, but do not question. The staff carried it like a second skin. By the time the meeting ended, something had shifted. No one made declarations or bold vows, but Catherine felt the quiet weight of solidarity taking shape. These were people who carried Diana's memory into their daily work, subtly resisting the changes that threatened to erase her presence. It was not open defiance, not yet, but in the slow-moving politics of the palace, solidarity could be the seed of something stronger. As she thanked them and watched them slip back into their duties, Catherine knew she was no longer alone. Others remembered. Others would guard the legacy. And in a place where silence so often triumphed, That knowledge was already a victory, the gala that changed everything. The palace glittered under 1,000 lights, its grand ballroom alive with the warm hum of conversation and the clinking of crystal. Dignitaries, philanthropists, and members of the press mingled beneath towering chandeliers, the air heavy with perfume and expectation. This was one of the crown's most celebrated evenings of the year, a night crafted to honor charitable work and showcase the unity of royal patronage. Catherine entered alongside William, her gown flowing like liquid silver under the lights, her smile perfectly measured for the cameras. She moved with quiet poise, every greeting warm and every gesture precise, yet beneath the surface a subtle thread of tension pulled at her. Queen Camilla took the stage with her usual composure, the room stilling as she began to speak. She announced the launch of a new charity initiative, her words deliberate, her tone carrying a confidence shaped by years of public life. Applause rippled through the audience as she spoke of progress, growth, and vision. Catherine listened attentively, her gaze fixed on the stage until her eyes drifted down to the glossy official program resting in her hands. She turned the pages slowly, scanning the familiar sections. Her fingers stopped at the page dedicated to a long-standing patronage that Diana had once championed with passion. In previous years, it had always been there, her image smiling warmly beside the children she had helped, the story of her tireless work woven into the charity's history. But now the page was unrecognizable. The paragraphs detailing Diana's efforts were gone. The photographs had disappeared. It was as though she had never been part of the story at all. Catherine's breath caught, and for a moment the lively murmur of the gala faded into silence. Her heartbeat filled her ears as she read the page again, hoping to find even the smallest acknowledgement. There was nothing. This was not an accidental omission. It was intentional. On stage, Camilla continued to speak, describing what she called a new chapter for the patronage. The phrase was wrapped in optimism, but its edges were sharp. Catherine felt the omission settle heavily in her chest. This was more than the quiet rearranging of portraits or subtle shifts in tradition. This was the rewriting of history, the removal of Diana's name from a narrative where it rightfully belonged. A photographer captured her in that moment, her eyes glistening as she held her smile steady. To those who saw the photograph later, it would appear to be a fleeting moment of emotion during a charity gala. Few would realize that in that instant, Catherine understood something had changed. The quiet whispers she had heard in private had now stepped into the open. As applause swelled and the music rose, she remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Outwardly serene, inwardly resolute, she began to form her plan. The fight to protect Diana's legacy had just moved to the public stage, and Catherine knew she would not face it quietly. The confrontation behind closed doors. The gala had ended hours earlier, but Catherine's mind had not stopped replaying the moment she saw Diana's name missing from the official program. Long after the music faded and the guests departed, that single page haunted her thoughts. The palace corridors were silent now, the air still beneath the warm glow of the wall lamps. She moved with quiet purpose, the soft tap of her heels against the marble floor echoing faintly until she reached the private reception room where Camilla sat, a glass of wine resting lightly in her hand. Catherine asked for a word, her voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable edge. Camilla agreed, and the door closed behind them with a muted click. The air inside seemed heavier, as though the walls themselves understood the gravity of what was about to be said. Catherine began slowly, each word deliberate, her tone measured but unyielding. She spoke of Diana's influence not only as William and Harry's mother, but as a woman who had reshaped the way the monarchy touched the public. She described how Diana's compassion had bridged the distance between palace and people, how her humanity had softened the institution's rigid edges, leaving an imprint on the nation's heart that could not be erased by time or politics. Camilla listened without interruption, her posture composed, her expression a mask of quiet control. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, each phrase chosen with care. She framed her decision as necessary for moving the monarchy forward, insisting the crown must adapt to a new era. Her reasoning was wrapped in the language of progress, yet Catherine heard the underlying truth. It was about shaping the narrative, deciding which parts of the past were honored and which were allowed to fade into obscurity. The exchange never descended into sharp words or raised voices. It was colder than that, and in many ways more dangerous. Two women, each carrying a different vision for the monarchy's future, stood on opposite sides of an invisible divide. For Catherine, history was not a weight to be discarded, but the thread that bound the monarchy to its people. And Diana's legacy was part of that thread's strongest fibers. For Camilla, the monarchy was a living institution that could and should be reshaped, even if that meant rewriting its story. A long silence followed, heavy with unspoken truths. Neither expected the other to yield that night. No agreement was reached, yet both knew the conversation had only just begun. When Catherine stepped back into the dim corridor, her stride was steady, her head high, but her resolve had hardened. Protecting Diana's legacy would not be a matter of sentiment. It would be a battle fought in deliberate moves, in quiet alliances, and in the shadowed corridors of the crown, where every step could shift the course of history. The public finds out. It began with a single image posted anonymously online. The photograph, taken inside one of the palace's most private corridors, showed an empty wall where an iconic tribute to Princess Diana had once hung. The framed portrait, instantly recognizable to royal watchers and cherished by the public, was unmistakably gone. Within minutes, the image began to spread across social media like wildfire. Hashtags bearing Diana's name and demanding answers shot to the top of trending lists. Comment sections filled with disbelief, anger, and grief. People from around the world shared memories of the princess, recalling where they were the day she died and how her warmth had left a personal imprint on their lives. For many, the missing portrait was not simply an absent decoration. It was a symbolic act, a deliberate erasure of Diana's place in the monarchy's story. News outlets quickly seized on the growing uproar. Morning programs aired side-by-side images of the same corridor, one showing the tribute in place and the other with the wall bare. Royal correspondents, careful with their language, nonetheless conveyed the weight of the moment. Some speculated this was part of a quiet but purposeful shift in the monarchy's presentation of its history. Others were more direct, accusing the palace of attempting to rewrite the past in plain sight. As the conversation intensified, public sentiment began to rally around Catherine. Though she had issued no statement, supporters flooded timelines with photographs of her wearing Diana's jewelry, visiting charities the late princess had championed, and speaking with warmth about her in interviews. These moments, once seen as gestures of respect, were now reframed as acts of preservation, evidence that Catherine valued Diana's legacy and understood its importance to the people. The palace's continued silence only amplified the storm. Each hour without a response gave the controversy more oxygen, turning what might have been a passing curiosity into a headline dominating international news cycles. Opinion pieces appeared in print and online, calling for transparency and questioning who within the royal household had authorized the removal. Behind palace walls, Catherine watched the reaction unfold with a complex mix of emotions. She had never sought for this matter to break so publicly, yet she could not ignore the momentum it had sparked. What had once been a quiet, almost invisible contest over memory and meaning had been thrust into the global spotlight. In the modern digital age, even a single missing photograph could unite millions of voices. For Catherine, the image was not just a piece of evidence, it was a rallying cry. It proved that the struggle to protect Diana's memory was no longer hers alone. The world had seen, the world understood, and now the world was watching. Tears, truth, and the unwritten future. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon outside a children's hospice where Catherine was attending a charity event. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, and the gathered crowd radiated warmth despite the cool breeze. Among them stood a little girl holding a worn book filled with photographs of Princess Diana. When Catherine knelt to greet her, the child hesitated, then slowly opened the book and asked in a small, uncertain voice if she had known the princess. The cameras captured what followed. Catherine's eyes softened. and for the briefest moment her composure slipped. She smiled through the shimmer of tears, brushing one from her cheek before answering. Her voice was gentle yet steady, carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Some legacies," she said softly, "are too precious to forget." The words, simple yet full of weight, seemed to hang in the air. The video spread across the world within hours. People shared it alongside images of Diana walking through minefields, holding sick children and embracing those so often overlooked. Commentators praised Catherine's sincerity, noting how rare it was for a senior royal to show such open, unguarded emotion. Hashtags calling for the preservation of Diana's memory began trending again, joined by thousands of messages from strangers who had never met her but still felt her presence shaping their lives. The palace maintained its official silence, but behind closed doors, something shifted. Quiet, measured conversations began about restoring certain tributes and allowing more of Diana's history to remain in the public eye. There were no formal announcements, no admissions of misjudgment, but small, telling changes appeared. A framed photograph quietly returned to a corridor wall. A charity brochure once again carried Diana's name in its list of patrons. Catherine did not see these moments as personal victories. She understood this was not a battle to win, but a trust to safeguard. For her, the heart of the matter was not about influence or public opinion, but about truth. Truth preserved in its fullness, not selectively edited to suit the times. She knew that history could be guarded out of love, or reshaped by those with the power to decide what would remain and what would fade. Though the cameras eventually moved on and the news cycle shifted, the image of Catherine's tearful smile endured in the minds of millions. It became more than a tribute to Diana. It became a quiet declaration of the enduring strength of compassion, even within the constraints of royal life. For those who saw it, that autumn afternoon marked something deeper than a passing moment. It felt like the opening chapter of a larger story, one where memory itself became a cause worth defending, and where a single act of empathy could keep a legacy alive for generations to come. Whispers of a new alliance. The days after Catherine's tearful encounter with the young girl felt different within the palace walls. The air carried a subtle change, as though the moment had awakened something deeper than mere public sympathy. Catherine moved through the corridors with her usual grace, but she noticed eyes lingering on her longer than before, quiet glances exchanged between staff that carried more than polite acknowledgement. It began with the smallest gestures. A long-serving attendant, one who had once walked beside Diana through these same hallways, slipped Catherine a folded note as she passed. Inside were only 4 words. She would be proud. There was no signature, but none was needed. Catherine folded it carefully and tucked it close, a warmth settling in her chest. The next morning, crossing the palace courtyard, a gardener who had served since the days of Charles and Diana greeted her with an unusually earnest nod. He said nothing about the viral video or the storm outside the gates, but his eyes spoke of memory and solidarity. Soon after, subtle signs began to appear. A footman restored a small framed photograph of Diana to a staff rest area, one that had quietly disappeared weeks earlier. A housekeeper ensured lilies, Diana's favorite, once again adorned a little-used reception room. These acts were not loud protests, but quiet affirmations, gestures that could survive in the shadows without drawing official attention. Beyond the palace, the ripple was stronger. Invitations poured in from charities Diana had once supported. Some were official requests for Catherine's patronage. Others were personal letters from organizers who remembered Diana's visits with undimmed fondness. They wanted to work with Catherine to create initiatives that echoed Diana's warmth and accessibility. Without issuing any public challenge, Catherine had become the center of something far more powerful than an organized protest. It was an alliance of memory, organic, unspoken, yet deeply committed. Inside the palace, she understood the fragility of this new energy. The monarchy thrived on control and curated narratives. Any open defiance would invite swift consequences. But here, in discreet exchanges and shared understanding, she saw roots taking hold that could not easily be pulled up. Catherine began meeting quietly with trusted individuals both within and beyond palace walls. Over tea and garden walks and at charity offices, they spoke of Diana's values and how to weave them into modern royal work without inviting confrontation. She realized that preserving Diana's legacy was not just about resisting erasure. It was about planting it so deeply in public consciousness that no official act could remove it. As autumn deepened, Catherine walked the palace halls with renewed purpose. The quiet tension with Camilla remained, but she no longer felt alone. She was part of a chorus, soft, unyielding, and determined to ensure the crown remembered the woman who had once worn it with such grace. And she understood the truth. Some legacies are not defended with grand speeches, but in whispers that grow too strong to silence. In the gilded halls of the palace, history is often written in ink that cannot be erased. Yet Catherine has shown that love, memory, and quiet courage can challenge even the most carefully controlled narratives. What began as a whisper became a wave, carrying with it the voice of a nation unwilling to forget. Diana's legacy now lives not only in portraits or programs, but in the hearts of those who choose to honor her spirit. Catherine's tears, her resolve, and the quiet alliance that formed around her have proven that some truths are too deeply rooted to vanish. The question remains, will the crown's future embrace its most human past or let it be reshaped by power? If you believe some legacies must be protected, share this story, subscribe for more untold royal truths, and join us as we uncover the secrets the palace never meant for the world to hear.